Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum, Dubious speculation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Ethereum is always an interesting topic to discuss, and for me, I really like to dive into the ETH Bitcoin pair. Now, we also will talk about ETHUSD in this video as well. But ETH Bitcoin is a very interesting topic, and it really guides the altcoin market. If you have felt this cycle like the altcoin market has been stuck in traffic on Struggle Street, you would be right. You would be right. And in fact, as we showed yesterday during the Bitcoin dominance video, if you look at the advanced decline index for the top 100 cryptocurrencies, it has been a downtrend since 2021, right? So there's been more declining than advancing, which is similar to the top after 2017 until a couple of months after quantitative easing began last cycle. And then once QE began, then the altcoin market started to really move with and even faster than Bitcoin. But ETH Bitcoin sets the tone for the altcoin market. I'm not saying that some alts can't go up. We've seen plenty do well. But the collective altcoin market, it needs the approval from ETH to say that, all right, ETH Bitcoin is sort of changing course. Now, the first two videos on my channel are actually about ETH. And in 2022, when we talked about ETH Bitcoin, I made several videos back then saying that ETH Bitcoin was in a massive distribution phase. And it pained me to read the comments back then because everyone just told me I was, crazy and insane. And I mean, maybe they're right, but it was hard to read it because I like to think that I was trying to just remain objective. Now, I don't get everything right, obviously. I get plenty of things wrong. But I did have a very strong conviction that this was just a massive distribution phase up here. If you go back and look at some of the very first videos on my channel, right? I mean, this is the second video I ever published. It was called ETH Bitcoin is severely undervalued, an analysis of past trends, correlations, and fractals. And again, this is the second video on my channel back in 2019. And so when this cycle was really moving, right? Once the bear market started in 2022 and then we got out into 2023, I was thinking, all right, well, at some point in 2023, hopefully the stars will align and we'll see ETH Bitcoin take the plunge. And it did, but then it took a lot longer to get to my targets, right? My target for ETH Bitcoin was between 0.03 to 0.04. Now, when I said that back in 2021 or 2022, I said it back over here in April, just before the first drop. I had no idea that it would take until, January 2025 to reach the 0.03 level, right? I had no idea it would take that long. Last cycle, ETH Bitcoin bottomed in the pre-halving year, right? In September of 2019. So if you were to equate that to this cycle, it would have implied a bottom in September of 2023. But it's now the post-halving year, and ETH Bitcoin never really truly found an obvious bottom, right? It never really found that. It's hard to predict tops and bottoms exactly. What you look for more so are, either a blow off top or a long distribution phase, right? In the stock market, typically when it tops, it's a process, right? When it bottoms, it just happens. But when it tops, it's a long process. You could argue that crypto is starting to exhibit some of those similar behaviors, especially when you look at all Bitcoin pairs. When they top, it's a process, right? And then there's just sort of the slow bleed as you convince more and more investors that this is the ultimate trend under the current, macroeconomic conditions, under the current monetary policy conditions. So this video here was from September of 2019. We talked about it was being severely undervalued. It was basically right here, right? And I look back on that and I'm like, maybe I got lucky. one of the reasons I launched my channel in 2019 was because I thought that ETH Bitcoin was basically at the bottom, and I just felt like it was a really great opportunity at that point, and I maybe I got lucky. It's not like I knew the Fed was going to print $6 trillion, but hey, it worked out. And then we got up here and we talked about it going to the 0.03 to 0.04 range. And it felt like no one would believe it, even though it seemed like the most obvious outcome. Now, when you look at it objectively, you can see that it was always going to happen. And we talked a lot about that, right? In terms of each cycle, you get your first top and then a lower high, right? Your first top and then a lower high, your first top and then a lower high. And in between those two tops, you get a range low, right? A range low that's set. And ETH Bitcoin then spends a long time above that range low, but it does eventually fade, right? Eventually it breaks beneath the range low. Now, in 2016, it bled about 50%, about 50%. After it broke the range low. In 2019, after it broke the range low, it bled about 30%. So far, this time, ever since it broke this range low right here at 0.049, it's now down about 36%, right? So basically almost 40%. So right now, it's kind of just in between the drawdown that you saw here after breaking support and the drawdown that you saw here after breaking support, right? It's kind of in between. It's not 30, it's not 50, it's kind of in between. I contend that maybe the reason this one was only 30 was because this was already a more massive drop, right? Now, back in 2022, when we talked about ETH Bitcoin going to, potentially as low as 0.03, it's hard to convince anyone that that was what's going to happen, right? It was really hard to convince anyone. And I even got, I went in through these phases during the cycle where I'm like, why am I even trying to convince people? It doesn't really seem like people want to know, want to be convinced. And I'm just arguing with people that are never going to see it through my view. But I still tried to make as many videos as I could bear to talk about this valuation and try to get people on the right side of it, right? To say, look, ETH is good. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. It's just going to bleed against Bitcoin for a while until monetary policy changes. Now, here's the thing. ETH Bitcoin has gone to kind of the lower part of the target range. I said 0.03. And here we are at 0.03. And it kind of feels like the exact opposite of 2022. Over here, I couldn't convince anyone that it was going to drop this far. But now, I'm almost, I'm more worried that I'm going to appear, it's going to be the opposite, right? Where I'm going to say I think it's going to go up at some point this year, a good amount, but no one's going to believe it. And people are just going to say, well, that's great and all, Ben, but what about the Bitcoin dominance train? And it's tough for me because I love the Bitcoin dominance train. Hell, I just put out an hour video yesterday on it. It's the easiest train to be on, to just put on your maxi hat and to just ride that maxi train for as long as you possibly can. And for me, I just said, well, ride it until 60% dominance at the very least, and that it's possible that ETH Bitcoin could drop until QT ends, quantitative tightening. Now, frankly, I'm surprised that we're in January 2025 and quantitative tightening hasn't actually ended. Now, if this is the first video you're watching on this channel, just to bring you up to speed, one of the reasons why I thought that ETH Bitcoin would bleed was because we entered into quantitative tightening. And when that happens, you generally see higher risk assets bleed to lower risk assets, which is exactly what's been happening. And it's exactly what happened last cycle. But one of the things you'll notice last cycle is that ETH Bitcoin bottomed when QT ended, right? Exactly. That's exactly when it bottomed. you know? So for me, I look at this chart and I say, well, from a sort of like a price prediction point of view, it made it to my target of 0.03. But back over here in 2022, when it was 0.08 and then 0.085, when I told people it was heading down here, it was falling on deaf ears, you know? And it took a while, right? I mean, it's not like it happened overnight. It took a while. It dropped and then it rallied back up. And then it just was a slow, painful bleed. And every single rally, it just drew it out. But in my mind, I knew this was the inevitable outcome, regardless of all these rallies that made people think that it had turned around. But now I'm at the point where this seems like it's good enough, you know? And the 0.03 level to me came because of returning back to where the bubble began. That doesn't mean it can't go below it. Also, another thing that coincidentally lines up with 0.03 is this thing, the fib retracement. So it's a little out there, but just bear with me. If you take a fib retracement on this first cycle, you'll actually notice that ETH Bitcoin this cycle topped out at the 2.618, and the range low was the 1.618, and then it went back up to the 2.618, and then it got back down to the range low and spent a while trying to hold on to the 1.618 and did not hold it, and then it came back down to the 2016 all-time high. The 0.786 from that level is 0.03, right? So that was another reason I thought, hey, 0.03 could be reasonable. The 0.618 would be all the way down at 0.025. Now, I got to be honest, right? I don't really think it needs to go that low. And if you had told me in 2022 that we'd be sitting at 0.03 and you'd have all these people that used to be insanely bullish on it at 0.05 now just dunking on it nonstop, I'd probably be like, well, it's probably pretty undervalued. And I gotta be honest, I mean, I think it is undervalued at 0.03. But the hard part about markets is that they can be undervalued for a long time. They can be overvalued for a long time, right? I mean, to me, I thought 0.08 was really overvalued over here. And it turns out it was the right view to have. But you can see it just took a long time for the market to accept that it was overvalued. Now, I think it's kind of the reverse, where it's like, I think that 0.03 is undervalued. But that doesn't mean that it has to reverse course immediately, you know? I mean, I'm sitting here thinking like, well, if what we really need is quantitative easing, or maybe we just need QT to end, then it could just continue on this path until QT actually ends. And then you could argue the more favorable approach could just be to see it end. But at the same time, we've seen some altcoins get really big rallies, even though QT never ended. But only certain ones. Most of them continue to bleed with ETH. So my thought process is this, right? My thought process is this. Going back to the video in 2019, where I said ETH Bitcoin is severely undervalued. Today feels like that to me, right? It feels like it's similar, that it's severely undervalued against Bitcoin. The thing about that video, when I made it, quantitative easing had just begun. Today, we still don't have that. Now, there's a Fed meeting next week, right? There's a Fed meeting next week. So maybe the stars will align for ETH Bitcoin, right? Where it will bottom out whenever the Fed goes from quantitative tightening, where they end quantitative tightening. And if you look at sort of the calendar here, obviously they're very likely not going to cut, and they really shouldn't cut with inflation starting to go back up. But maybe one of the tools they'll start to use, because they don't want to keep cutting, is the balance sheet tool. Now, the meeting is on January 29th, which is, 4 days from now. So, if Powell comes out and says that quantitative tightening is over, if he comes out and says that, then I would say there is an extremely high chance that ETH Bitcoin is bottoming at 0.03. Extremely high. If he comes out and says, to hell with the degens, you guys continue to yell and scream at each other as you fight over, the different cryptocurrencies, and we're not ending QT, it's always possible that it could just keep going down. And it doesn't mean that it's, not valuable. It just means that it's a subject of the monetary policy of the time, right? So for me, when I think about it, it's not, it's not about predicting exactly when the bottom is. I mean, it's at the range low of my target range, 0.03, but it's about saying, until QT ends, there's always a chance it could go lower, because the markets can be irrational for a long time. And I think, like, if you think back to 2022, when ETH Bitcoin was at 0.085 and everyone was like, well, you've got the merge, you've got the deflationary aspect going on, there's no way it could drop to 0.03. Again, what pained me the most was, like, I saw what they saw, right? I knew the narrative. It's not like I didn't know. It's not like I didn't know that they were going to go to proof of stake. It's not like I didn't know that the deflationary aspect was going to affect things. It was that in my mind, none of it mattered, because we weren't in the monetary policy regime where it would matter. I think all of it's important. I do. It's just that until you get to the appropriate monetary policy, the market isn't going to think it's important, even though I think it is. It's just that, and that was what I was trying to explain to people back then. It's not about that I think it should go there because of, because of that's the way it is. It's more so like it's just monetary policy thing. And I do consider Ethereum to be a higher risk asset than Bitcoin. I do. Now you see why, right? Now you see why. The one thing that I spent a lot of time talking about yesterday, though, with Bitcoin dominance and whatnot, was, how do you get QE, or how do you at least get the end of QT? Now, I guess it's theoretically possible to get it without a big drop in the market, right? It's possible. There could be political pressures applied that potentially make the Fed pivot sooner than they otherwise would have from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. And I think it makes sense to be prepared for that outcome. However, if the Fed does not succumb to political pressures and they truly stay the course, then you always run the risk of a landing at some point, right? Now, the hard part about this is that in order for QE to really return during an inflationary cycle, you would have to think that something bad would have to happen, right? Some bad data print, right? Something out of left field that no one's expecting, right? Like where the unemployment rate, two ways it could actually work, actually. I was thinking about this. 2 ways it could actually work. One way is it just shoots up, right? Where, it's been at like 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, and then we just wake up one morning on a Friday in the first week of the month, and it's at like 4.5 or something ridiculous, right? Something just absolutely insane that no one is thinking about. That's one way you could get it. The other way that you could get it is if it drops like a rock. Like, let's say it gives you an insane print of like a 3 number. Like it starts with a 3 again. The reason why that could be an issue is not because of a recession, right? I mean, that would be the opposite. It would be the unemployment rate's going down. It means there's not a recession. But the reason why it could become an issue is because it would send the long end of the yield curve absolutely flying higher, right? Absolutely flying higher, and you don't want that either, really. But it seems like there has to. I mean, there doesn't have to be, right? But you would think that if the Fed is truly not dependent, and they're not going to succumb to political pressures, you would think that there'd have to be some type of event to create a reason to transition from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. Something. Who knows what that's going to be, but you would think that there would need to be something. Now, there's one thing I've looked at, probably a little too compulsively, if we're being honest with each other, and I think I can be honest with you guys. It's this website, right? It's Ultrasound Money website, and I have followed this so much to understand like the mechanics of when is it getting burned, how quickly. I've spent way too much time looking at this stuff, but it was because of this that helped me to stay bullish on Bitcoin dominance and stay on the right side of the ETH Bitcoin trade for at least a majority, hopefully a majority of the time. And the reason I've tracked this is because back in March, I know, and I guess back in March and April, I noticed that if you look, okay, so here's the merge, and as the merge happened, initially there was this huge deflationary aspect of it where the supply of ETH was getting burned. But then, starting in April of 2024, it started to go back up, meaning the demand just simply wasn't enough to offset, right, the supply, the supply, the new supply. And what's ended up happening is the supply has started going up again, right? It bottomed out around negative 455,000 since the merge, and ever since then it's been increasing. Now, I have thought for a long time that there's going to be some type of event whenever this crosses zero. And I mentioned this back in April, and I think I also mentioned it in August on Twitter. But I talked about this back then, that there could be some type of transition in monetary policy around the time. I know this sounds crazy, right? But it's just something I've thought that might happen, right? Some change in monetary policy around the time that this crosses zero. And maybe it would imply that the excess in the system, excess liquidity, excess in the labor market, just excess is gone. And now the new administration isn't dealing with excess anymore. They're dealing with a pretty loose labor market that needs liquidity and it needs, something to keep it going. I just wonder if when this crosses zero. Now, when will it cross zero? I'm glad you asked. Well, if you look at it on a daily time frame right now, the supply of ETH is increasing by about 1,500 ETH per day. Now, it's subject to change every day because some of you degens get a little bit more excited on some days than others, therefore the gas fees go up. But let's just say it's about 1,500 ETH a day. I've watched it a lot the last few weeks. Some days it's closer to 1,000. Some days it's closer to 2,000. Every once in a while, you'll get a day where it's negative 2,000 because people are just going insane on the recent batch of meme coins. But, if you look at it over the last 7 days, you can see that sort of that recent drop around some of those meme coin launches. But over the last 30 days, the supply of ETH has gone up by about 42,000. Okay? So the implication of that is that within the next 30 days, there's a chance that this crosses zero. Right? I mean, if you think about it, it might only take a couple of weeks from now before this crosses zero. So maybe the Fed doesn't stop quantitative tightening at the January meeting. Maybe they don't. Maybe they stop it at the February meeting. Maybe there's something that happens between January and February that causes them to make that pivot. Keep this in mind. Watch this. Watch this to see if anything happens as it crosses zero. Now, as it, going back to ETH Bitcoin, the easiest way to get out of this dilemma that ETH Bitcoin is in my view, would be to see some type of volatile market event that gets the Fed moving in the other direction, right? Could also be an inflation print that drops a lot, right? It drops, say, down to 2.5 or 2.4 and making them realize they don't need to worry about inflation going back up. But I'll believe it when I see it because the last 3 months, inflation has just been going back up. Do you need an event to happen? Well, that brings us to ETHUSD. Now, ETHUSD has been a thorn in my side this cycle because, you know, I was just on the Bitcoin dominance train. You know, I've been bearish on ETHUSD primarily because I've been bearish on ETH Bitcoin. But as I said, if Bitcoin goes up, it's going to drag ETH with it. It just won't. ETH isn't going to go up nearly as much. And it's like how do you get ETH out of this zone? It's been essentially allergic to 4K every time it goes up to it. And not only that, but every time that ETH hits 4K, the whole market just tanks. Right? Every single time. Market tanks when ETH hits 4K. It happened in March. It started happening here in June, and then it happened again in December, where Bitcoin just kind of stalled out for a couple of months. Now, here's the thing. There's two ways I think ETH gets out of this pickle that it's in, especially as it relates to the ETH Bitcoin pair. Option number one is the more optimistic way. So we'll cover it first, since I know a lot of you guys are optimists. Let's say it holds the bull market support band. Let's say it holds, okay? If it holds and the Fed becomes very accommodative over the next couple of months, it's possible that ETH rallies back up without having to see further downside. Possible. The only way I could see that happening is if, not the only way, but the main way I could see it happening is if the new administration applies enough political pressure to get the Fed to pivot before they should. If that happens, then there's certainly a chance that ETH makes the run back up to 4K and maybe even to new all-time highs without having to see further downside. However, if Powell says next week that QT is not ending again, right, and now we're in the post-halving year, if he says it's still not ending, then there's always a chance you get one last drop. Okay? Now, I'll be clear. If there is a drop, if there is another drop, I think that'll be it before new all-time highs. Okay? There's, again, I mean, if you followed me for a long time, I get some things right, I get some things wrong. One of the things I've been wrong about, it's always important exercise, right? And if you're new, you already know what I'm going to say. Or if you're not new, if you've been here for a while, you already know what I'm going to say, but I'll say it for the sake of the people that are new. One of the things I notice is that you start watching a YouTuber and they make a couple of good predictions, and then you think they just know everything. You're like, oh, well, this guy surely knows. He's got a crystal ball. But I'll let you in on a little secret. I don't. And if you think that, I will disappoint you very, very soon. So let me go ahead and tell you something I have been wrong about so that we, do away with the illusion that I won't be wrong, because I will. This is something I've been wrong about this cycle, right? I mean, I thought ETH would, quote unquote, go home this cycle, and home essentially was this fit to this logarithmic, these quote unquote non-bubble data points, the lower logarithmic regression trend line. I thought that was going to happen, and it never did, right? It simply never happened, and I'm like, well, I guess it's a cycle that it never went home. Right? And I thought it could go down there without having a recession. It turns out I think I might have been wrong about that, because it never went down there and we never had a recession. So if the optimistic view is right, then this is still irrelevant, right? It's still irrelevant if the optimistic view is right and ETH can hold above the bull market support band. In fact, what I would say is this. As long as ETH is above the 20-week SMA, which is currently at a little over $3,000, let's just say it like this. As long as ETH is above 3K, then I think it slightly favors the more optimistic view, right? If ETH drops below the bull market support band, and it's below 3K, then I think it would actually favor the view I'm about to talk about, right? Now, again, if you've been watching this channel, you've heard me say it 1,000 times. It hasn't happened. And that's why I would say, with ETH Bitcoin at 0.03, you're not going to find me, staying bearish on ETH Bitcoin, right? I think it will go up. I don't know exactly when the bottom's going to be, but I do think it will go up sometime this year. And I think whenever the turn comes, I think it'll be a big bounce. But if ETHUSD loses the 20-week moving average, if it loses it, then you could get one final drop. Now, one of the things to think about here is the Bank of Japan, right? Like, what is he talking about? If you look at Japan interest rates, you'll notice that we've had 3 over the last year. The first one was in March. The second one was in July. The third one was in January. March, July, January. March, July, January. March, July, January. Go to ETHUSD. When did it bottom here? April. So, Bank of Japan the Bank of Japan raised in March, wick low in April. When was the next rate hike? It was in July. When was the next capitulation wick? It was in August, right? So you basically, what you had was you had the BOJ, the Bank of Japan, raising rates in March and July and now January. And you had capitulation wicks by ETH in April, August, February. I don't know, right? I'm just saying, if there has to be an event to get us to QE, seems like this is it. Now, there might not have to be. Again, if Powell comes out next week and he just says, no, we're not going to QE yet, I wonder if it would trigger some event. I just know that in March, the Bank of Japan raised rates, and at first, everyone thought it was fine and nothing was going to happen. And then before we knew it, the whole crypto market was dropping. And then in July, they raised rates, and for a little while, it was okay, and the market was holding on, and then August came and all hell broke loose. And now it's kind of the same thing, right? It's January. They just raised rates yesterday. And I'm just wondering, February would also correspond to likely when the ETH supply reaches the pre-merge supply, February of 2025. It's kind of interesting, right? I mean, it's kind of interesting. Now, if there is a drop in the market and ETH does fall below the bull market support band, then I think it would enter into its final drop before a new all-time high. That's what I think. Okay? I haven't given up on ETH. I mean, I do think it will go to new all-time highs, but there's always a chance it has to get one more drop. Now, if I can find evidence next week in what Powell is saying and whatnot, that it seems like maybe we don't need to get that drop, then I'll come here as quickly as I can and say, it looks like it's holding support here. Okay? So I'm not going to try to hold on to this narrative for longer than I have to at this point, and it's one of those things where I'm just putting it out there because everyone was wondering what the hell is going on with ETH. Why is it just stuck below 4K? And I keep thinking the reason might just be because it never got that drop. Like it never actually got that drop. Now let's hope. I think, look, over the long haul, it's better to be an optimist than a pessimist. So I don't really think you should go into this like hoping that it's going to get that drop. I think you should go into it hoping that it doesn't and hoping that it just holds the bull market support band as support and gets that move higher. I think it makes sense to try to be more of an optimist. At the end of the day, the bears sound smart, the bulls make money. And that's the way the markets always work. Bears sound smart, bulls make money. I'm just pointing it out there as a risk to sort of identify that, the last 2 times the Bank of Japan raised rates, ETH had a capitulation the following month. And maybe the same thing is about to happen again, right? This pattern we have seen once before. It's not exactly the same thing, so I will talk a little bit about some of the differences. But the pattern is with the S&P in the 1990s. I know you guys like it when I dig up these analogs from just random periods in the past, where if you look at the S&P in the 1990s, there was also a similar pattern where it had like a top and then another top and then another top, where this final top actually had sort of a double top that went above the prior two tops. You see that? Now, if you go to ETHUSD and you look at it on a daily time frame, what you'll notice is that technically these two tops right here did go above this top from way back over here. And also you will notice that it is a double top. Just like the S&P, right? Just like that. Just on a smaller time frame. And what you'll notice is that the S&P had a drop and then it had a lower low. And I have to imagine everyone was insanely bullish right there as it looked like it was breaking out. Just like with ETH right here, as it looked like it was breaking out, and then it just came back down. But guess what happened? It managed to drop into one final lower low. Now, calling for recessions is a fool's errand, right? No one knows exactly when they're going to happen, and they're only obvious in hindsight. And usually they come out of left field when no one's expecting it. The idea that everyone's going to just predict it and be right about it is nonsensical, right? The markets will not, most people will not be able to predict whenever there is a recession. Normally what you do, though, is you wait for at least the stock market to, go through a distribution phase. Remember, it's a process. Capitulations, an instant. The topping area is a long process. So you look for that distribution. You look for the S&P not being able to break a certain number over and over and over again. The market will give up, and then it drops. And if it drops, that leads to layoffs. Layoffs lead to recession. So this green shaded region is, in fact, a recession that allowed the S&P to go to one lower low. Now, that lower low probably scared a lot of people because it was a recession, but it didn't last very long, right? I mean, it didn't really last that long. And it was back right up moving not that long later and going to new highs. Now, one way that this is different than Ethereum is, as it was up here, these were new all-time highs. But for Ethereum, these are not all-time highs, right? There was another high way back over here. So it's not exactly the same chart. But one way it's really similar, and it's kind of getting a little out there, but I'm just going to say it. One way that it's similar is if you go look at this interesting chart, I believe it's U.S. interest rates minus the 2-year yield. Now, look at this. U.S. interest rates minus the 2-year yield have hit this trend line 3 times. One time was just a few months ago. Another time, financial crisis. The time before that, 1989. Okay? So, this, by the way, here was the dot-com crash. Sometimes you get these peaks where you don't really have recessions. My point, though, is this. Is that when this happened in 1989, first of all, the metric dropped. No recession, right? No recession. And then the recession finally occurred, right? After this drop ended, when it bounced, that was the recession, right? So I'm watching this and I'm looking like, is it going to bounce? Again, this is U.S. interest rates minus the 2-year yield. Because when it bounced in 1988 or in 1989, 1990, that's when you had a very brief recession. If you look at the S&P, you can see what I'm talking about. It entered it in July of 1990. And it dropped, and then we came out of it. It bottomed in October of 1990. If you go back over here to look at this, that was as this metric was peaking. That was the bottom of the S&P 500. As that metric bounced, that's where the S&P found that bottom. So One idea is that, well, first of all, the optimistic scenario would just be that political pressures are applied. By the way, the optimistic scenario is only good in the short term, because over the more longer term, we're going to pay the price more than likely if they cut too soon, if they cut too much too soon, and if they go back to QE too soon. We'll pay the price eventually if they do that. But let's just say they don't do that. Let's say first they do that, then I think ETH does not have to get this capitulation, and it can just go up to a new back up to 4K and try again. If Powell comes out next week and is very, very dovish, I think that is a way that ETH could get that rally and finally break through 4K. If Powell comes out and says, all right, we're going back to QE, and maybe we're even going to cut rates again next month or in March, then I think you could very well see ETH just go ahead and get that move. But if Powell just says, no, enough is enough, and they're not going to do it, and he sends us waiting another month or two. Let's see when's the next meeting after the next one, after the one that's coming up. It's not till March 19th. So if Powell just comes out and says no, and that he's not going to begin QE, then I wonder if that will then sort of finalize the devaluation of ETH Bitcoin into some major event. That occurs that then causes a drop in the markets that then leads to the introduction of QE potentially in March. What's interesting is if you look at the 2016 cycle, I've looked at this a lot. ETH made new all-time highs in March. So you could even have a drop and then it still just get right out of it a month later. Or maybe we just hold support at the bull market support band and it just goes and puts in new all-time highs in March if the political pressure is applied. But I'm just putting this scenario out there so you can kind of see that there's two different paths, and I don't know which one is going to play out. I think it depends on what the Fed does, frankly. I really do. If I knew what Powell was going to do next week, I would be more confident, right? If I knew that they were going to end quantitative tightening next week, I would just be saying, really, 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 really good chance that ETH Bitcoin is bottoming at just 0.03, right? If I knew for a fact they were going to end quantitative tightening next week. But I don't know. And that's the beauty of the market, right? I mean, no one really knows what's going to happen. So I will say this. Try to be optimistic, right? And view it through an optimistic lens, because over the long haul, I think it's better to be an optimist than a pessimist. And also, again, the bears sound smart, the bulls make money. So I'll be watching ETH with the bull market support band and see if it can hold it as support, kind of like it held it as support right here. You see that? Kind of like it held it as support right there. But if it just kind of fades below it, right? If Bitcoin gets rejected from this range and actually goes back down instead of breaking out in February and March like it did last year, then it would lead to Ethereum getting this move. And that's where it ultimately comes down to, right? I mean, if Bitcoin can break out to 140K, 120, 130K, there's a good chance ETH is just going to go back up to 4K, right? If Bitcoin does not make that break in February and instead it sells off and goes back down to say like 90K or even goes below that, that's how you could see one sort of final capitulation in the market by ETH. But again, I don't know if you're going to get it, but I will say if you get it, it's probably not going to last very long, would be my guess. So that's the way I'm thinking about the market. With ETH Bitcoin at 0.03, I already think it's undervalued against Bitcoin. The USD valuation can always remain irrational for really long periods of time. And I think the reason why ETH USD has struggled so much is just an artifact of monetary policy and an artifact of quantitative tightening lasting a lot longer than it otherwise would have. And I know you could argue and you could say, well, some altcoins have done fine. Like, it's not like they needed, quantitative easing or anything to get a bounce on their Bitcoin pairs. But you have to remember that the altcoin market, they're all sort of at different phases. And one of the more popular comparisons this cycle has obviously been Solana. But as I've said, I mean, I think you could make the argument that Solana is following ETH in its Bitcoin path, right? I mean, ETH Bitcoin had this distribution phase up here, and it had these higher lows. Eventually, it broke down into this low right here, and then it got a secondary rally back up before then eventually it just bled. That's the same thing Sol Bitcoin is potentially doing, right? And we talked about this last year. We said, look, it's probably going to capitulate into December and then bounce in early 2025, and that's exactly what it did. Distribution phase, right? Higher low structure. Eventually it breaks down, just like ETH Bitcoin, right? Eventually it breaks down, then it goes back up into a secondary distribution phase. Could that be what Sol Bitcoin's doing right now? It's very possible, because that's exactly what ETH Bitcoin did. And you know what? Even the percentage move down is similar, right? This is an 89% drop. This is Sol Bitcoin, 89% drop. ETH Bitcoin, guess what? Same thing, right? If you go to a price range from the top, it's 89% if you draw it accurately. I've done it before, but it's like, yeah, it's right around 89, 90%. But it should be, I'm pretty sure it's 89%. So you basically have the same drop. Similar move up. Sol Bitcoin went up a little bit more than ETH Bitcoin. But I almost wonder if you're just if the argument is that it's just sort of doing the same thing, it's just behind by a couple years. Because Sol Bitcoin, you can see that it came out a lot later than ETH did. So a lot of alts get these moves where they get this massive move up in their first cycle, they drop, and they get sort of this secondary move up, and then they fade again. That's kind of what ETH Bitcoin has done. I mean, I almost wonder if you can take a bar pattern here. I mean, it's not going to line up exactly, right? But maybe on a log scale. And copy that and put it onto the Sol Bitcoin chart. I mean, you can kind of see what I'm talking about, right? I mean, is it is it really that different, guys? I'm telling you, I mean, it just looks like the same damn thing. Anyways, I digress. It's not about Sol. That's about ETH. But I do find these patterns interesting to watch. And, I fought the good fight with ETH Bitcoin. I've mentioned that Sol Bitcoin might just be following it, but I'm not getting into the trenches with those, with those degens. I did it with the ETH degens, and I used to be an ETH degen back when the good times were rolling, when monetary policy was loose. And maybe I'll be an ETH degen again here coming up soon, but I don't want to get into it with them, because first of all, I could be wrong, right? Just because ETH did it, just because I was right about ETH doesn't mean I'll be right about Sol Bitcoin following that same pattern. But it's not a fight I really want to spend a lot of time fighting anymore. So anyways, those are my views, and we'll see what ETH Bitcoin does. I would say optimistic scenario is that Powell goes to QE next week, and it allows ETH Bitcoin to bottom, and ETHUSD holds the bull market support band and goes back up to 4K. Pessimistic scenario, Powell comes out and says, screw the degens, QT continues, and in that case, maybe it leads to some type of event that forces them to start QE in March. And that could be, how it happens. But those are the two most likely, paths. It's just going to depend on what happens, I think, next week. And maybe it's not just next week, but also the week after, as that labor market data comes in. Because a lot of the times when you got those capitulations by ETHUSD, it was right after the labor market data came in. It was like a bad data point or something. So we'll see what happens. Anyways, if you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe. Give the video a thumbs up. And again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. See you guys next time. Bye.